do a little bit of both then, because that's what I planned for. All right. Thank you all for coming. So, who am I? My name is Roy Sutton. I am the Open WebOS Community Manager, which if you guys came to my previous talk, I talked a little bit about what that means. And being a community manager means, at least from my position, helping the open source community work with the source code that we've released as part of Open WebOS, and specifically take the concerns of the community internal to the company, and then take the needs of the company external so that the developers know what's going on. I've been a WebOS fan since 2009, shortly after the Palm Pre came out, and have been really active in the community, from blogging to everything. After blogging, I started working for Palm in the developer relations, and the rest is history. But we're going to get into that history because that's very interesting stuff. So WebOS, as you may or may not know, was first announced in 2009 at CES. And it was sort of the hit of the show. It was a multitasking operating system that used card-based metaphor, slick web-based graphics. Apps were created using these web technologies. And the press went wild for it. It was released in June, exclusively on Sprint, and it wasn't until January, February the next year when it hit Verizon, somewhere around there. But in any case, it was very tough. Everybody said it was going to be the iPhone killer, and that's a very tough hype to live up to. But the highlights were that we released the Palm Pre, we followed that up, or at the same time we also released the Pixie, or shortly after. Followed that up with the Pre 2, the Veer, which was supposedly the world's smallest smartphone. It's really cute if somebody's got one to show off. Then we had the Pre 3 and the Touchpad were the last two WebOS devices that were released. Unfortunately, almost 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, HP made the decision to discontinue the WebOS hardware. And this was a very tough blow for those of us who work in the Palm division, and it was very tough for the consumers who really very passionate about WebOS. I think we've got people here still hanging on to their phones because they love the operating system. And I do too. I still have my my Pre 3 and my Pre 2 on Sprint. This still has the radio from the one that I bought in January of 2000, or June of 2009. So it's held up really well. But so the decision was made to cancel it. But let's see. There we go. Talked already about the card-based multitasking. This is the touchpad. It was a tablet computer. It still is a tablet computer. 10-inch widescreen, and the card-based multitasking. It had sort of mixed reviews. Everybody loved the software. The hardware, maybe not as much. And was discontinued. It was put on fire sale at $99 each, and they flew off the shelves. People, that's apparently a good price point for a tablet. People loved it. But the upshot was that that after they canceled the hardware, they were left with the software, and they were wondering what are they going to do with it. And those of us internal sat around and biting our nails, wondering, because our jobs were on the line here, what would they do? This is right after Meg Whitman had taken over, and she said she wanted to take some time to think about this decision and make a good decision. So we waited and we waited, and finally in December of 2011, she just said, we're going to open source WebOS. And this was sort of a surprise for some of us because we really didn't think that was going to be an option that HP would take. But they did. And shortly after that, in January, we announced how we were going to do that. So open sourcing a big project is easy. It's really easy if you don't care what the results are. You can throw some code up onto GitHub and say, hey, here's an open source project, everybody enjoy it. that won't get you very far. Unfortunately, it's not easy. So there are a lot of concerns that have to be addressed when you're thinking about open sourcing a project. And we're going to try and get into each one of those. Some of them apply to OpenWebOS, some of them apply to other projects, but they're all things that have to be kept in mind. One thing in particular that made things somewhat more complicated for us is that we decided we wanted to be able to benefit from the intellectual property that's within WebOS, to continue to develop that internally and use it for proprietary projects. And so we needed to think about the issues of, what code can we release, what code can we not release, and we'll definitely get into all of that. So what we decided to do was to divide OpenWebOS up into pieces, and we would release pieces at a time. This had a number of different benefits for us. First off, it let us test our procedures, let us test our tools. We decided that we're going to use GitHub to host our code, and we needed to find out, okay, does this work? Do we have a gateway that can be used to upload code? Will the community be able to take it? What tools do we need to use in order for them to be able to build this? What documentation do we have in place for people outside the company to be able to build? Have we adequately separated the pieces so that they can actually be built separately? There are a lot of dependencies often within large projects like an operating system where one piece won't compile without another piece. Just a quick overview. It was a pretty ambitious schedule. In January, the NO2 framework, which is not technically part of OpenWebOS, was scheduled to be released. And in February, we were going to announce our government model and release our Qt WebKit extensions, the JavaScript core, and some additional pieces with NO. In March, we were going to look at announce our graphics extensions and the level DB and USB extensions. April was going to be more about NO and Aries. In July, we were going to release our system manager, which provided the card-based multitasking, the system manager bus, and the core applications that made up OpenWebOS. August, we were going to release our build release model and the beta version of OpenWebOS. And in September, we were going to release, this September of 2012, we were going to release OpenWebOS 1.0. This schedule was produced in January, well before we had gotten a lot of experience in open sourcing these components. And it was a very tough schedule. There were probably things we would have arranged differently if we could have, knowing now what we know. But we actually kept to the schedule, and practically everything was released on time. Some things were released early. There certainly were hiccups along the way as we released bits of code. Things didn't always work as well as we would have liked them to, but we did meet our objectives. So what were some of the minefields that we encountered along the way? There are a number of them that come up when you release a project this size. HP has been a player in open source for a long time, and even Palm used a lot of open source components within WebOS. If you go to opensource.palm.com, which will redirect you somewhere else now, but if you go there, you'll see that we've used a lot of open source projects, and we've contributed back the code that we've used within the projects, conforming with the GPL license where appropriate and other open source licenses. But that's contributing bits of code back. That's very easy, and there's an easy procedure at HP for taking and contributing code back to a project. But HP, to my knowledge, has never actually taken a closed source project and made it open source. Certainly nothing on this scale. So there were a lot of things that we discovered along the way. So let's talk about them. The first thing is the license. When we were sitting down and trying to figure out what are we going to do with OpenWebOS, we're going to open source it, but what license is appropriate? A lot of thought had to go into this. We could have gone with a GPL license, which would require anybody to contribute back their changes. That has some benefits. It could also limit what we could do with it, though, internally, unless we wanted to dual license it. And dual licensing has its own issues. In the end, we decided on an Apache 2.0 license, which to me is one of the most free licenses. You can take the code and pretty much do anything you want with it, include it in a commercial project. If you make changes, proprietary changes, you don't have to contribute them back, although we certainly welcome pull requests and encourage them. But so the license is important, but there is certainly more than just the license of the individual pieces that has to be taken into account, and I'll get into that in a moment. The second thing is intellectual property. A company the size of HP, and particularly a company like Palm that innovated a lot of things in the mobile space, there are patents tied up within Open WebOS that are valuable, or within WebOS that were valuable. And we had to go through and decide in each case, okay, if we release this code, we're granting, through the Apache license, the right to use this patent. Do we want to do that? Is this code something we want to release? So one of the things we learned very early on is you need to get the lawyers involved very early, because they're lawyers and they take their time about things, and the default answer from lawyers is no. So if you say to them, we'd like to release this, no. So that's easy. If they say no to everything, then nothing bad happens, in theory. So you have to convince them, okay, no is not a good answer. We need to release this code. So help us figure out how we do this and still protect the interests of the company. Certainly this would have been a lot easier if our intention was to just let go of WebOS. We could have just open sourced everything and said, well, we don't care about the intellectual property and we don't need to make money off of WebOS in the future. But that's not what we wanted to do. Another thing about the intellectual property that we needed to be concerned about was that WebOS made use of closed source projects as well. We licensed a lot of technology from other companies, and we couldn't release their code because we don't have any rights over their code. Sure, on devices, once you've been delivered that, you have a license to use some of that code, but for Open WebOS, we didn't have that. So we needed to make sure that code that we could release was under an appropriate license. One of the things that you want to be careful of is that, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later, is that you don't include projects with conflicting licenses. We don't want to include something GPL licensed in our Apache 2.0 that would cause all of the project to then become covered under GPL. And I'll cover that in just a little bit. But let's talk here about code quality. One of the things that maybe is surprising and maybe not is that before you release your source code, you really want to make sure that it reflects well upon your company. And closed source code can be rather messy sometimes. There's a lot of stuff people stick in the source code because nobody's ever going to see this. And this could be as simple as, you know, calling your boss names in the comments, or writing disparaging things about your competitors' products. These are things that you don't really want to show up in the GitHub repository. So we had to go through a lot of code cleanup. And we had a procedure in place to do this. We had to make sure that, for example, we don't have code names for unreleased products that might give away things. We don't want to, as I mentioned, call out competitors, whether we're, you know, you won't want to comment in your code saying, haha, I just stole this idea from the iPhone. You know, that might be bad. Not saying that we had those comments, just as an example. But things that you might not think about, like personal information. Let's say you put some information in there, like here's some sample data we could use, and you list somebody's name, phone number, and all that. That's probably stuff you don't want out on GitHub. What about private keys? In a closed source project, you don't have to worry about somebody getting your keys, so you might store them right in the code. Things like that need to be filtered out before they can be uploaded. It wouldn't have done for us to accidentally release, say, the signing keys for the touchpad applications. That would be bad. Let's see what other things I can mention. The other thing is making sure that like I mentioned before, the open source projects, make sure you're using them appropriately. Sometimes code is placed in line, like, okay, this code is licensed under this, and we got this from so and so. It's right in line with other code. Well, you'll need to separate those out so that you don't have any licensing issues. There are tools that can help with this, code analysis tools, tools to scan. You can get a dictionary of bad words and run each source file through that and make sure that you're not have expletives littered throughout your code. But in the end, somebody has to go through and look at each piece. And going back to the whole IP question, when there's code that you can't release, you have to stub it out. And stubbing out code can be very difficult. You can't just say, okay, well, we're just going to return 0 here every time. That could crash things upstream. You have to make sure, okay, what are appropriate responses to this? What can I return? Should I be doing something else? Can I find another project that I can replace this proprietary code with? It's a lot of work just to release that. And the next piece was, as I mentioned, the license pollution. You want to be sure that that you pick appropriate licensing, that projects that you embed with your code work together. You don't want to get things exposed, like I said, through the GPL. If you had GPL v3, it might require you to release your signing keys. That could be a problem. One issue that we ran into is we use Open Embedded for doing our builds, and the Open Embedded layer files are all licensed under MIT. So if we wanted to contribute something upstream for Open Embedded, those files have to be licensed under MIT. The rest of our project is licensed under Apache. So we had to make a decision that, okay, we're going to have Apache licensing for everything except Open Embedded layer files. So it may seem like a small thing, but we need to be sure that we address that. So the next thing I want to talk about is community. As somebody said to me, releasing the code is really step 0 for an open source project. Having the code out there, just throwing it over the wall and putting it on GitHub doesn't really do anything if nobody ever picks it up and uses it. And Tom King, who's not in here right at the moment, talked on Friday about what it is to be a community manager. And a lot of work had to go into making sure that people could take the code and use it. That includes the documentation, forums, mailing lists, public JIRAs where people can file bugs. There is the setting up of social media, IRC channels. All sorts of things have to go into finding developers, getting them excited about the project, and getting them involved. So if you're going to have a successful open source project, these are very important things. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening now with OpenWebOS. So OpenWebOS has been released for a little over half a year now. And in that time, the WebOS ports team, which is an external group, has taken WebOS, OpenWebOS, and ported it to a couple of different hardware platforms. And this includes the Galaxy Nexus and the Nexus 7 tablet. And Patrick has taken OpenWebOS and got it running on the Samsung Series 7 Slate, or whatever it is. Hold that up for people. That's spooky. But So for us right now, the future is working with the open source community to help take Open WebOS onto hardware. Now, certainly we've got a lot of initiatives internally that I can't talk about where we're using Open WebOS, but as far as Open WebOS and getting it onto devices, we're working closely with the WebOS Ports team. So that, in fact, I just burned right on through there. That, in fact, ends the stuff that I had prepared. So I'm going to open it up to questions then. Yes?
I'm calling the question and I give you a chance to answer here. Is there anything besides speculation about the WebOS profiles that you had on WebOS with Open WebOS?
We will be trying to open up the profile servers for use with Open WebOS, but I don't have any dates or concrete plans for that right now.
Do you plan it? Or
We're working on it. Yeah, I don't have anything concrete I can say about the profile servers, but we would like to make it as a seamless experience as we can. Okay, one of the things that Open WebOS has is that certain parts of the operating system, your user profiles, your accounts, are backed up to the web, to HB servers. And if you lose your phone, you can start a new one, and all of your apps and settings are automatically downloaded again. What we'd like to do is make it so that when you start up an Open WebOS device, all of your settings come down to Open WebOS as well. So that's what the profile servers are for. Yes?
are there any internal plans for WebOS HTTP that you care to talk about, or is it all
No, there's really nothing I can talk about yet. Keep watching. I'm sure we will have some announcements at some point that will be exciting, interesting. I can tell you that it's very interesting for us. So, yeah. Yes.
I have one similar user side for this project. Work with a company I'm supporting with my director of our software development team, our CTO, he's been there since day one.
Mm-hmm.
We're putting some stuff on GitHub. We're using a caching license. We don't know. It's very long, but it's also L100 text file for most.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's communication doesn't exist, we're completely unreliable. Anything that goes down with it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's why we went with caching license. Several of our projects, for instance, I'm using WebOS History, which releases large amounts of code.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 of the 4 repositories that we're on GitHub, one of them March, we developed improvements to them,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in the cakewalk. The 4th one is an addition library with proprietary code made internally.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a technical level, the CTOs and the software level are saying, just do it. Why is it not out there already? But in our corporate and legal and business leadership functions of companies, they're thinking, oh, hold on, we have to double check, and they're going through this process, and nobody wants to own the decision to say that this means something that was not intended to mean something else.
Mm-hmm.
So in your case, you had a CTO who basically went away and came back and said, I've decided we're going to make this more simple. Do you have any thoughts about kind of separating out the process of, I as a developer need to stop the company that we are going to release something more simplistic,
Mm-hmm.
and yet, trying to think about the best way to hold people to it so that I don't, lose my job or get yelled at from, owners or something. What's the process you would go through to say, bring everybody in and kind of walk through that decision making so there's traceability and documentation around that so that urgency can come from it?
It's a complicated process, and I have some documentation that I can share and some that I can't. But we have reams and reams of stuff that we've generated, process flows for going through open sourcing a component, the steps that need to go for legal, things that need to go for developer reviews, QA. I didn't talk about QA, but QA has a very important role in open sourcing, not just not just testing that the code works, but making sure that the individual pieces work, that um, that I'm sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked with your question here, but yeah.
We've gone through everything you said.
Mhm.
Put up the build service to do all the sanity testing, all the unit testing.
Mhm.
We removed all the glib comments
Mhm.
about this blankety blank bug came back again.
Yeah.
But we fixed it last time, right? We removed all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
We've gone through the process, and everybody underneath a certain level is completely bought in and believes in the process and believes in the quality of what we're putting together, and we're making it work well. It's just getting, I'm asking somebody else in the company to give me a piece of paper that's signed that says there's no discrimination, et cetera, for us open sourcing something that we've also licensed to try to get licenses. So it's gone very legal, and I'm trying to kind of sever that process. So, I'm not kind of up against the wall sometimes with asking people to make the decision, and everybody has to give up,
Yeah, that's a tough piece there. And fortunately, we didn't have to face too much of that. We had a committee that was in charge of looking at each component set and saying yes or no. Um, it sounds like you don't have somebody who's ultimately responsible for saying yes or no on this one, or they aren't willing to step up. Mhm.
so if it's giveaway, then it's okay, but it's happy. But if we make it an improvement, then they want to, put revenue from it, licensing, those kinds of things are very difficult.
Yeah, I mean that just highlights the difficulties in open sourcing a project. There are pieces that somebody wants to hold on to because they perceive some value in it. Um, I don't have any particular advice on that, but I did want to roll back to the QA thing. QA, we've had to set up servers so that we can build the open stuff. See, we've got our own internal stuff that we're building with our proprietary pieces, and we've got the external stuff. So we have to have two separate build systems. We have to have gateways. One of the things that was very important for us because we have proprietary things that we're working on is we had to build sort of an IP gateway between our internal systems and our external systems. And we're using a code review tool called Garrett. And Garrett acts as a gateway. So if we want to push something up, it sits in the middle and makes sure that we're not releasing code names, partner names, things like that that we don't want to go up into the public repository. And because we've got that, we need to have a build system that builds externally with all the components, internally with all of our components. There are a lot of moving pieces to make sure that you don't break the build either internally or externally. Questions? This is a good question. I'm going to repeat it because I realize we're streaming now, and I should probably be repeating each one of your questions. And I got a microphone here for the next person. The question about whether we replace the proprietary pieces with open source where we can, and whether we would continue to use the proprietary pieces internally or move to the public ones, is a good question. And we spent a lot of time replacing proprietary code when we could, with open source code. And it's not just I'm trying to think of an example where we would still continue to use the proprietary piece internally. Um, One example would be that I think I can use, I hope, is like a Bluetooth stack. We have a proprietary Bluetooth stack, and we would like to replace that with an open source Bluetooth stack. And going forward, I think we would like to continue to use the open source one to get the benefits of the open source community supporting that and not having to maintain two separate code bases. So absolutely, where we went through in every place that we could, we've replaced a proprietary piece with an open source piece, and we want to continue to maintain that and support it in the open. It's another thing that was very difficult for us is WebOS was based on a very old build of Open Embedded. We had heavily customized Open Embedded to build WebOS, and we were several years out of date, several years out of date. And when we were going to release the open source version, we realized we would have to come up to a modern build system because we could not expect people to downgrade to an extremely old version of Open Embedded. And so a lot of work had to go into getting things working correctly on the latest Open Embedded and making the transition from the older recipes to newer recipes. And it's taken a lot of work to get people up to speed on that. And one other thing that I forgot to talk about while I blasted through the slides was that there can be a cultural shift that has to take place when you open source a closed source project. People are used to working in certain ways with proprietary code. You don't have to take into account what other people may be doing with the code. You may be used to having the final say over everything that happens, or you may not be used to having to integrate code that comes in from other people. And these things have to be addressed. If you're going to work successfully in an open source project, you have to take pull requests from the community. And if you don't like their code, you have to tell them why you don't like it. Doesn't do any good to just say your code is rejected. That doesn't help anybody, and you may drive away somebody who could be a good contributor. You have to take the time and say, okay, we're not going to accept this code because you didn't follow the coding guidelines, and there's some problems with your variables here, and we don't like global variables and other things. So you have to take the time to explain what's wrong with the code, and you can't just in a proprietary project, George works on something, Bob works on something. You take both their code, you stick it together, and you don't have to credit George or Bob because everybody's working together on the team. In an open source project, recognition is extremely important. So if you take a pull request from somebody, you can't just cut out their code and then stick it in to your code and say, it's good, I got it from Bob, fine. No, you have to maintain that pull request chain. You have to make sure that you have the traceability. Where did this code come from? Absolutely. Yeah, GitHub is successful because they enable that traceability. You can see where each code commit came from, who was responsible for it, and branching and merging is very easy. So, yeah, tools like GitHub are very important for an open source project, I think. Other questions? Anyone? Well, one of the things I'd like to say then in closing is that I encourage you all to get involved in Open WebOS. There's a lot of great code out there, a lot of great people working on Open WebOS, and we would love to see what you guys can do with it. Thank you.